And now listen to a reading from the Gospel of Luke. Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking with him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but they had stayed awake. They saw his glory and the two men who stayed with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things they had seen. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
On a trip to the Holy Land, our group visited the Church of the Transfiguration on Mount Tabor. Emblazoned in the ceiling is a stunning mosaic, and there's a copy of it here on the communion table for after the service if you'd like to see what it looks like. But it's absolutely stunning, and it features the scene described in our lesson today. We see Jesus at the center, arms outstretched, his feet barely off the ground, his face aglow. In the background on his right is Moses, feet resting in a small cloud, holding the 10 Commandments given him by God. To his left, feet also in a cloud, is the prophet Elijah, draped in a cloak that represents his appointment as a prophet of God. Standing alongside on solid ground are Peter, James, and John, looking dumbstruck, flabbergasted, and even alarmed. What are we to make of this astonishing scene? First, you need to know the background in what was happening just prior to today's lesson. Jesus had asked his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter responded, "The Messiah of God." Then Jesus thrust himself deep into the conscious and subconscious lives of Peter and the rest, ordering them not to tell anyone, stunning them into a kind of delirium when he said, "The Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and scribes, and killed. And on the 3rd day, he will be raised. If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me." I think that in today's lessons, Peter and James and John are for real. They make their way with Jesus to the top of Mount Tabor more than a little shell-shocked. They've been ready to see visions of saints of old like Moses and Elijah, who represent the essence of the faith of their mothers and fathers. Around 1,200 years before the birth of Jesus, Moses was the one through whom God's laws were channeled during his dramatic visits to Mount Sinai. We read in Exodus how the clouds covered the mountain, and the glory of the Lord was like a devouring fire on top of it. When Moses descended with the tablets of the law, the skin of his face was shining so much that he covered it with a veil. His companion is Elijah, who lived about 300 years later, and whose name means "Yahweh is my God." He was a prophet during the reign of Ahab. In 1 Kings, we read about his confrontation with the priests of the fertility god Baal. He challenged them to a contest on Mount Carmel, crying out, "O Lord, answer me, so that this people may know that you are Lord, O Lord our God, and that you have turned their hearts back." So this takes us then to the heart of our glory-filled story on Mount Tabor. Jesus' face is transfigured, and his clothes become dazzling white, as along with Moses and Elijah, he is shrouded in glory. There we find Peter and his companions were weighed down by sleep, But since they had stayed awake, they saw Jesus' glory and the two men who stood with him. Through a glass darkly, they must have sensed that the scene that was playing out between Moses and Elijah and Jesus was a foreshadowing of the way of the cross and would be theirs if they followed him all the way to Jerusalem. Blessed Peter tried to buy some time. Let's hang out here a little longer. We'll pitch 3 tents, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah. Let's just settle back a little bit. Let's let things simmer down. And while Peter was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. And then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my Son, the beloved. Listen to him." Only Jesus was left alone, and Peter and James and John headed down the mountain, silenced by what had occurred, determined to tell no one what had transpired. Perhaps later they would fathom more fully what they had witnessed when they heard the words of Jesus that were circulating, something he said on the Sermon on the Mount. "I've come not to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. Listen to him." This week I was privileged to be part of the Bible study that meets with Harry each Friday, going over the lesson for the coming Sunday. I'd like to share with you a bit of the mood of our class as the news of the invasion of Ukraine swept over them. I asked those present to describe their thoughts, their feelings about the guns of war raging once again in Europe. One of the members said he was with Peter and James and John, that he was in a dark cloud, terrified. And he went on to recount his own experiences in the military, knowing what war can do to human beings, God's children, makes him sad beyond words as he witnesses what is happening in Europe, in Ukraine. We took time to share our collective anguish in the face of the cruel and unnecessary invasion of Ukraine. And out of our anguish, we began to listen for a word from God's chosen one. And such is the way spiritual insight comes in our lives. On the far side of anguish and bafflement and overload, we go silent in the face of mystery, straining always then to hear what Jesus has to say at a time like this. Well, let me shift gears just a bit. I told the class about a trip that I had taken to Eastern Europe in the 1990s as part of a delegation of Presbyterians visiting sister churches after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Marianne Lundy was part of that same visit. We visited Hungary, and while I was there, I preached a sermon in the Hungarian Reformed Church on Freedom Square in Budapest. On my way into the church, my guide pointed to bullet holes in the pews of the church. The pews were part of that uprising. People were inside the church doing battle and coming out. In 1956, that was put down, that rebellion was put down by Soviet troops, and horrendous suffering followed. One of the stories told me that day has stuck with me. There's a bishop by the name of Hegedus, and he said something that led to his house arrest that lasted for 2 decades. He preached, "Long after the red star is gone, the star of Bethlehem will still be shining brightly." And that ended his public ministry for a long, long time. From there, we made our way to Ukraine and to visit a Reformed church near the western border at the foot of the Carpathian Mountains. The country had made its declaration of independence from the Soviet Union in 1991, and we were there just a couple of years later. It's interesting, in our brief visit there, we saw lines of tractor trailers hauling grain into Eastern Europe as a hint of what the rich farmland was like in that country. And I've read in recent days that, for example, Israel gets 40% of its grain from the Ukraine. It's a breadbasket in that part of the world. What will happen when those trucks no longer drive? We spent an evening in the home of one of the church leaders. In recent days, that experience has flooded back into my consciousness. As Peter and James and John discovered, time is not bound to move us incessantly into the future. God's glory shines backward and forward in a way that makes the past a present reality. I remember that house as if I could see it right this minute in a photograph. In the dining room, there was a table laden with dumplings and chicken and pork and bread and pickles, the best pickles I've ever had in my life. I can taste them still. Prayers were offered. Conversation bubbled up about life in general in the church in Ukraine, a small but mighty church in the Reformed tradition. I remember a trip into the backyard at dusk. I was looking for the outhouse, and there, as I stepped down the steps into the backyard, was a great big pig in a crate. And I realized I had just met a living composter in the Ukraine. The pig is there by the door. But it was a very peaceful and transformative night. Over the years, I've pondered why Jesus took so much criticism for the company he kept. Why were people always nagging at him? You eat and drink with sinners. You eat and drink with people outside the pale. Why do you do that? Even a tax collector like Matthew, you break bread with Matthew. His critics, along with Jesus and his followers, understood that when we break bread with another, our lives are joined forever. It's no wonder that to this day racist ideologies insist that strangers be kept at bay, eating by themselves and drinking from their own fountains. If we listen carefully to Jesus, we'll hear him tell us to do as he did and have our lives enriched and redeemed with table fellowship wherever we can find it with all sorts of folks and human beings. Mary Ann and I talked this week about our hearts aching for the brothers and sisters in that household and congregation in Ukraine, some deceased, some still living. Their dining room gave us a taste of the peaceable kingdom, and now they're living in stark terror. What happens to them happens to us, and our hearts cry out in anguish. We strain to hear what God's chosen one is saying. At the very least, he's telling us to take up our crosses and follow him on the path toward the peaceable kingdom for which we pray every day in our lives. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on heaven as on earth. We strain to hear Jesus' voice that bids us to love all our neighbors as ourselves and to take up our crosses and follow him toward the peaceable kingdom that our Father in heaven intends for this good world that he creates. In closing, I'd like to talk with you a bit about our beloved family from Afghanistan that has made its way to San Diego, where they're currently living in an aunt's house, so that a member of the family can get the medical care that is needed at this point. The aunt is a doctor. She's been in the United States for 12 years with her husband and will be a great resource to this family. We're very sad that they left as quickly as they did, but we do indeed understand the urging that they got from the aunt to come to be with her and why they've made that trip. We'll miss them. And what I'll miss more than anything else is going through their front door and whatever the time of day, being ushered to their table to eat what was there. The dad and I talked for long hours about their flight from Afghanistan and days filled with experiences of love and tenderness and sorrow and fear, and most of all, hopes for the new life they were building in this country, one day at a time. And it dawned on me, and it's dawned on you as I'm speaking, that each time we sit at a table and drink hot tea and eat rice, we are sharing our lives in a sacramental way, as surely as what transpires at the table before us in the sanctuary. Food and drink together in love is transformative. And lives that were once separate and unknown to each other become one body. Jesus teaches us that, one body in his name. Jesus would have it this way, that we risk those table conversations, knowing that our lives are being joined, come what may. And here I'd like to add one more story that's not in my text. I was out for a morning walk, And it flooded back into my consciousness, and I cannot resist telling it. As they were preparing to leave one day, the husband said to me, "We'd like to give you a gift." And I said, well, that's fine. And I said, "What is it?" And he said, "We want you to have some rice." And he proceeded to tell me at some length, in Afghanistan, this is the way rice is cooked. I'm not a rice cooker, so I'd listen, but I couldn't follow the whole thing about soaking the rice and all the rest. He said, "You've got to have some of our rice." So I went out to the car. On the way out, raised the back trunk and watched as one of the young boys staggered out the front door of the house, carrying a bag of rice that I was to discover when I read the label weighed 40 pounds. Donna, you may know where that came from. I don't. Somehow, in preparing to hunker down and live a long time in Santa Fe, they had gotten that much rice. Now, part of the story is that I've been having treatment on my back at the pain and spine center, and I'm told right now I cannot ever lift more than 20 pounds, not 40, 20. And so when I drove the car into the house, where's Nina sitting now, back there, I said, "Nina, you've got to come out to the garage and unload some rice." And she thought, well, can't be that big a deal. And so she staggered away from the car and carefully put the rice down. And there it sat. And I thought, that's not ours. Whose is it? Well, a piece of this story is that very day when they were announcing they were leaving because they had to go to San Diego, the dad had an interview lined up at Pete's Place to be in the administrative staff of Pete's Place. Some of us had worked to help him make that contact, and I was very excited about it. But I spent some time telling him, now let me describe what's going on in the yard outside and the front of the building and the kind of place that it is. And I painted a picture, like you read in the newspaper and like our members who work there know. Didn't faze him a bit. I think Kabul can match and triple and quadruple that scene in many, many corners of the city. And I said, what do you think about working there? He said, "I love to help people. I love to help people." As I thought about that a few days back, I thought, that rice, that bag of rice, that 40 pounds of rice is going to Pete's Place, where homeless folks in this city will have some very good rice. Nina was very impressed by the label as she read it carefully. But that will be served to people in this community in their hour of need. Friday, I called Bruce Black and said, "How's your back?" And he said, well, he wasn't too keen on lifting it. Nina put it back in the car. I drove down to Pete's Place, and Bruce came out with a cart and loaded it up and took it into the kitchen. I love that. I love that scene. And now that all has transpired and the family is out there in California, I will be telling the dad exactly where his rice has gone, and that his love and compassion and care for others is being realized in Pete's Place in Santa Fe, New Mexico. After their flight on Wednesday was canceled, they weren't able to fly to San Diego until Friday, with lots of help from Donna Fleetwood and others, and the aunt, I must say, in San Diego, who managed to get the plane tickets. And the last thing Farhad said to me was, this is after the chaos of 2 days of trying to get on a plane and living with his family in a hotel that Donna had gotten for them. Farhad said to me, "My family's fortunate that I speak English and can help find plane tickets online." Oh my, how fortunate we are that God sent this lovely, wonderful family into our midst for just a second, for a moment that has enabled us to be bound together sacramentally forever. Thanks be to God. Amen.